Chapter 1: The Last Night by the Water. The metallic taste of blood clung to the air long before anyone realized where it was coming from. It mingled with the scent of damp pine needles and cold morning mist drifting over Bodom Lake. Something was dripping from the torn canvas of the tent, slow, rhythmic, almost calm, like the lake itself was counting down the seconds until someone finally dared to look inside. A lone, ragged breath broke the silence. Then another. Somewhere inside the crumpled shadows, a boy lay half-conscious, his fingers twitching against the wet ground, trying to remember whether the cold he felt came from water, or from the metal glint pressed against his skin just hours before. Birds chirped overhead, far too cheerfully for a place now holding more questions than bodies. And the lake, endlessly patient, reflected nothing but a pale sky, as if refusing to reveal what it had witnessed when darkness swallowed the shore. A pair of fishermen approached, their boots sinking into the soft moss. One slipped, muttered a curse, and brushed dirt from his jacket. Another stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, like his voice had been stolen by the forest. Inside the tent, 3 teenagers lay unnaturally still. Only one was breathing. Barely. His eyelids fluttered. And for a moment, that fragile moment between shock and memory, he saw a silhouette standing just beyond the thin sheet of the tent. Black. And something bright. A color like fresh paint. Or fresh blood. A face he couldn't focus on. A shape he couldn't explain. The world spun. His pulse thundered in his ears. And the first coherent thought that clawed back into his consciousness was painfully simple. He's still out there. The fishermen didn't know what they were looking at yet. They didn't know they were about to become the first witnesses to one of the most haunting cases in Finland's history. They only knew that their plans for a quiet summer morning had just sank faster than a stone tossed into Bodom Lake. But you're about to walk into a story where truth wears many faces, and none of them ever stay still for long. You think truth is always on the side of the victim. You think memory is a loyal archivist of what really happened. You're wrong. Sometimes, memory lies more convincingly than any suspect ever could. And tonight, we're going to tell the story of a boy who survived the night when he was supposed to reveal everything, yet instead left behind a mystery thick enough to fog the surface of Bodom Lake itself. The night when silence became louder than any scream. The night that refuses to be forgotten. Chapter 2: Before the Darkness Came. The days before the tragedy were warm in that quiet Finnish summer, the kind of warmth that settles gently on your shoulders, convincing you that nothing bad can possibly happen as long as the sun stays up. That illusion tends to shatter the loudest when darkness falls without warning. The 4 teenagers, 3 boys and 1 girl, were not much different from any group chasing the illusion of freedom. They carried rolled-up tents, borrowed fishing rods, and enough optimism to fill the lake twice over. Their laughter rushed ahead of them as they walked, bouncing off birch trunks in the worn dirt path like an echo of a life still unbroken. Nils, the youngest, had a quiet, observant way about him. He didn't say much, didn't joke as loudly as the others, but smiled in a way that hinted he was storing everything for later retelling. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too big and boots that made a soft scraping sound, the kind of details you don't notice until they're the only things left behind. His best friend, Seppo, the kind who always tried to look tougher than he was, smoked cheap cigarettes he pretended were expensive. He flicked ashes with the confidence of a man twice his age and none of the responsibilities. Elvis hair. Leather jacket. A swagger that fooled absolutely no one, except maybe himself. On the other side of the group walked Anya, the girl with sunlight in her hair and a laugh so sharp it cut through the forest hush. She wore her favorite red ribbon tied carelessly around her wrist, a small, bright thing that would later haunt too many photographs. And then there was Bo, tall, easygoing, the unofficial leader. The kind of guy who could get a laugh out of a stone and probably charm a bear into returning someone's stolen picnic basket. He carried the tent and insisted it wasn't heavy, though everyone knew he'd be complaining about his back by morning. The plan was simple: one night by Bodom Lake. A little swimming. A little flirting. A little pretending they were older, freer, unsupervised, because in 1960 Finland, a night outdoors still felt like rebellion. They set camp on a gentle slope near the water. The sun stretched itself across the lake like it was showing off. Someone made a joke about the mosquitoes, the unofficial national bird, and someone else pretended to swat a whole cloud of them to death. Even the forest seemed to laugh along, its branches shaking softly in a warm breeze. None of them knew this would be the last evening they would ever spend together. None of them knew they were building their tent on ground that would soon become a crime scene so perplexing it would puzzle investigators for decades. Irony is cruel like that, it never warns you in advance. They roasted sausages. They argued about music. Someone teased Seppo about the girl he liked back in town. In return, he swore he'd push someone into the lake, a threat that sounded about as convincing as his cigarette brand. For a moment, a small, fragile moment, everything was perfect. The kind of perfect that makes life feel solid, reliable, safe. And then, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, the forest changed its tone. The birds quieted. The air cooled. The shadows lengthened in oddly precise ways, like someone had drawn them with too much intention. But the teenagers didn't notice. Why would they? Youth has the remarkable ability to mistake omens for scenery. Bo zipped up the tent and said, half joking, "If anything creepy happens tonight, it's definitely Seppo's fault." "Yeah," Seppo replied, "I attract trouble. Trouble finds me irresistible." If the night had ears, it might have laughed. If destiny had a sense of humor, and it usually does, just a very dark one, it might have whispered. "We'll see about that." The forest exhaled. The lake stilled. And somewhere far beyond the circle of lantern light, something, or someone, listened. They didn't know it yet, but the darkness had already arrived. Quietly. Patiently. Step by step. Waiting for the right moment to move. Chapter 3, Shadows over the Tents. Night crept over Bodom Lake without ceremony, slipping through branches and settling over the campsite with the soft inevitability of a closing eyelid. The moon rose pale and thin, casting a faint glow that made the water look like a sheet of dull metal, cold, reflective, indifferent. Inside the tent, the four teenagers were still laughing about something stupid, probably Seppo's hopeless cigarette lighting attempts in the wind. The flame refused to behave, flickering like a warning he was too busy swearing it to notice. Outside, the forest no longer sounded alive. No wings. No cracking twigs. No rustling grass. Just silence, the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that comes before a storm. Or before something worse. Anya was the first to feel uneasy. She kept glancing at the thin canvas walls as if expecting them to melt away and reveal someone standing right behind them. She didn't say anything, the fear was small, irrational, the kind that embarrasses you if you admit it out loud. Bo, half asleep already, mumbled. "Relax, it's just the woods. Trees don't bite." Maybe they didn't. But something else did. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Time feels unreliable when darkness turns the world into a single, shapeless room. Then came the sound. Soft. Measured. A footstep, pressing down just enough to bend moss, not enough to snap a twig. Seppo froze mid-sentence. For once, he didn't have a joke ready. Another step. Closer. Deliberate. Anya whispered, "Bo, someone's outside." Her voice cracked on the last word, a thin fracture of dread. "Probably a deer," Bo muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. A deer doesn't walk like it knows exactly where a human tent stands. Nils felt his heartbeat crawl up his throat. He pressed his ear to the canvas, carefully, silently, and listened. Footsteps again. But this time, they circled. Slow, patient, methodical. Like someone tracing the outline of a target. The lantern inside the tent dimmed as the battery weakened, leaving them in a diluted glow barely strong enough to distinguish each other's faces. Outside, the night seemed to thicken, turning into a dense, watchful presence. Then, a shadow. Barely a flicker. A hint of movement at the edge of what little light escaped the tent seams. "Who's there?" Bo called out. His voice tried to sound strong. It didn't succeed. The forest offered no reply. Seppo reached for a pocket knife, dull, barely functional, the kind of tool meant for slicing bread, not defending oneself. He muttered under his breath, "If it's a bear, I'm dead. If it's a person, I'm even more dead." It would have been funny if it weren't terrifyingly accurate. Something touched the tent. Not a hit. Not a drag. Just A brush. Like a fingertip tracing the fabric. Anya's breath hitched. Nils pulled his knees closer. Bo clenched his fists despite knowing fists wouldn't mean much. The presence outside lingered for a moment. Just long enough to ensure they knew they weren't alone. Just long enough to plant the seed of dread no one could shake off. And then, nothing. The footsteps faded into the forest. Silence returned. Suspicious, unnatural, too complete to be comforting. Bo exhaled shakily. See. Probably an animal. But even he didn't believe his own words. And somewhere, deep within the forest's black corridors, something, or someone, turned back for one final look at the flickering lantern trapped inside the tent. A faint red glint shimmered in the darkness, like fabric catching moonlight, or eyes reflecting it. Had any of them stepped outside, maybe they would have seen the figure walking away. Black clothes blending into the night. A streak of bright color, crimson or scarlet, cutting through the darkness like a warning sign. Maybe they would have seen the long, deliberate stride. Or the face, half obscured, half memorized by shadows. But they didn't. And the night swallowed him whole. The teenagers didn't know it yet, but the fragile line between safety and catastrophe had already snapped. The darkness had come for them. Now it was only waiting for the right moment to strike. Chapter 4, The Survivor's Eyes. Morning didn't arrive at Bodom Lake so much as it leaked in, a thin, watery light pushing through mist and silence, reluctant to illuminate what the night had left behind. Dawn should have brought warmth, birdsong, movement. Instead, it delivered a stillness so unnatural it felt like the world was holding its breath. The fishermen approached the campsite first. One of them, older, broad-shouldered, smelling faintly of gasoline and lake water, stopped mid-step when he saw the collapsed tent. He squinted, rubbed his eyes, as though hoping he was misreading the scene. He wasn't. The canvas was ripped open, as if by something impatient or furious. The ground around it was disturbed, trampled. And the silence, too heavy. Too absolute. He called out, "Is someone hurt?" But the words cracked before reaching the tent. Inside, the first thing he saw was the unnatural stillness of three bodies. The second thing he saw was movement. A twitch. A hand. A breath so thin it barely stirred the air. Nils. His face was pale, lips trembling, his hair matted with dried dampness. Blood clung to him in places he couldn't yet understand. He tried to lift himself but collapsed back, his world spinning, narrowing, darkening. Everything was noise, the fishermen shouting, footsteps rushing, the distant wail of an ambulance siren carried by the wind. Yet through all that noise, something else lingered, sharp and impossible to ignore. The last image burned into his mind before consciousness slipped away. A figure. A man. Black clothes. Something bright, red or maybe orange, slashing across the dark like a signal flare. The colors blurred together in his half-conscious memory, but the feeling remained, fear carved into bone. The fishermen pulled the tent open, revealing the tragedy inside. They tried not to look too long. They failed. One muttered to the other, "Who could do something like this?" The other didn't answer. How do you answer a question that large? Paramedics arrived, working with practiced efficiency, although even they were shaken. This wasn't the sort of scene you walked away from unchanged. As they lifted Nils onto a stretcher, his eyes flickered open. For a second, he wasn't seeing faces or trees or sky. He was seeing the night again. The shadow standing just outside the thin tent wall. The glint of color. The certainty that whoever it was, they were looking directly at him. One of the paramedics, a woman with tired eyes and coffee breath, leaned in close. "Can you hear me? Stay awake. Stay with us." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. Nils tried to speak. His lips parted. A single word escaped, hoarse, broken. "Men." The paramedic frowned. "What men?" But Nils had already slipped back into a trembling haze. His mind replayed the scene on an endless loop. The soft scrape of footsteps. The shadow stretching across the canvas. That impossible red glint. Was it a jacket? A cap? A scarf? A reflection? Memory isn't a camera. It's a painter with shaky hands, dipping the brush into fear and guessing at the shapes. As the ambulance door slammed shut, the forest around them seemed to close in again, folding its secrets back into pine needles and quiet soil. One of the officers at the scene stood near the shoreline, hands buried in his coat pockets. He stared at the tent as if trying to force it to reveal what had happened. He had seen crimes before, but something about this one felt wrong in a way that gnawed at instinct itself. "Do you think the boy saw the attacker?" a younger officer asked. The older one shrugged, his jaw tightening. "Maybe. But what he remembers and what actually happened." He let the rest of the sentence dissolve. No point finishing it. Everyone knew the truth. Traumatized memories twist themselves in ways the mind can survive. At the same moment, Nils drifted in and out of consciousness in the ambulance, haunted by that same shapeless face. Black and bright red. A contrast that didn't belong in the forest. Later, when he would finally give his first proper statement, his voice would shake, but the description would remain. A man, dressed in black, and something bright red. Clear enough to be unsettling. Vague enough to be useless. A detective wrote it down, muttering under his breath. Great. A man in black with red. That narrows it down to everyone at a rock concert. Black humor, the coping mechanism of anyone who has to witness the aftermath of violence. But buried beneath the sarcasm lay a deeper truth. This case was about to become a maze with no center. And Nils, the only survivor, was now the most fragile thread leading into it. The forest remained still. The lake reflected innocence it no longer possessed. And somewhere beyond the tree line, memory and reality continued their quiet war, one Nils wasn't sure he could survive. Chapter 5, Birdwatchers and Blurred Faces. The morning news spread faster than the mist rising off Bodom Lake. By the time police sealed off the area, half the region already knew something terrible had happened. The other half had theories. That's the thing about tragedies, they attract stories the way light attracts moths. Or in this case, birdwatchers. Two of them had been roaming the forest that morning, binoculars bouncing against their chests, notebooks tucked into vest pockets, dressed in shades of green and brown so thoroughly they practically blended into the trees. Their plan had been simple: wake before dawn, spot a few rare species, brag about it later. Instead, they walked straight into a nightmare. The officers found them sitting on a fallen log, pale and shaky, like people who'd just witnessed something their hobby had not prepared them for. One held a thermos so tightly it looked ready to crack. The other kept nervously adjusting the focus wheel on his binoculars, even though he wasn't looking at anything. A detective crouched in front of them. "Tell me again what you saw." The older birdwatcher swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed like a trapped creature. "It was early," he began. "Just after sunrise. We heard nothing unusual. No yelling, no fighting, just normal morning sounds." His partner added, "We thought we saw someone moving near the tents. A man. Tall. Long blonde hair." "Long blonde hair," the detective repeated, scribbling notes. "Any other details?" The two exchanged uneasy glances, as if afraid of sounding foolish, or worse, mistaken. "He moved strangely," the older one said finally. "Like he was trying not to be seen. But also, not rushing. Not panicking. Just walking. Walking." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Away from the tents." "More like, along the ridge. Parallel. As if he was watching the place from a distance." "And you didn't approach him?" The birdwatcher blinked. "Approach? Do you approach wolves?" His partner nodded emphatically. "Exactly." The whole thing felt wrong. Like everything was too quiet. Even the birds stopped. The detective allowed himself a humorless smirk. That must be serious if even the birds noticed. Normally, birdwatchers complained about noisy hikers ruining their peace. But that morning, they would have welcomed a noisy hiker. Or 10. One of them pulled out his notebook, not the one for recording species, but a smaller one he probably used for shopping lists or reminders. He flipped through the pages nervously. "I wrote it down," he said. "Because when something scares you, you write it down or else you won't believe it was real." The detective took the notebook. On the paper was a shaky line of text. Men with long blonde hair, walking toward the eastern woods. Alone. Did not look at us. No mention of black clothing. No mention of red. This was the first major contradiction. The detective closed the notebook. Could you see his face? No, both said in unison. One added, but you don't forget hair like that. Long, very long. Like a curtain. Birdwatchers tend to notice details, the angle of a wing, the shape of a beak, patterns most people wouldn't even glance at. But even their eyes were unreliable that morning. Fear changes what you see. Shock changes what you remember. And silence changes everything. Later, when newspapers got hold of their statements, they sensationalized the blonde-haired man into a ghostly figure, a forest phantom, a Scandinavian myth walking on two legs. It would have been comical if the backdrop hadn't been so grim. One headline read, "Mysterious long-haired stranger seen near lake." Another went with more flair. "Who wandered the woods at dawn?" The irony. Those birdwatchers were probably the most clear-headed witnesses in the whole case. They weren't drunk. They weren't confused teenagers. They were sober men with binoculars and notebooks, practically biological cameras with coffee breath. But even they couldn't give police anything solid. A man with long blonde hair. Walking. Not running. Not hiding. Just walking. And the strangest part? He never looked at them. Not once. As if he didn't care that he was being observed. As if he already knew he wouldn't be caught. As if the forest itself had given him permission to pass through unnoticed. When the detective asked one final question, would you recognize him again if you saw him? The men hesitated. Finally, the older one answered. I don't know. His face, it's like it wasn't there. Or maybe I was too afraid to see it. The forest behind them rustled softly, wind slipping through branches. The lake reflected the pale light of late morning, pretending it hadn't been a silent witness to something monstrous. And the birdwatchers sat there, staring at nothing, clutching their notebooks like lifelines. In their world, everything could be categorized, wingspan, feather color, call pattern. But the man they saw didn't fit into any category. He was a blur. A silhouette. A question mark walking on two legs. And somewhere out there, among the trees, the shadows, the quiet, that question mark had already disappeared. Chapter 6, Hypnosis and Echoes of the Night. Hospitals have a smell that clings to memory, antiseptic, metal, something cold and permanent. Nils had been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, slipping between the harsh brightness of fluorescent lights and the darker, heavier glow of the night that refused to leave his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, it was there again, the shadow, the red glint, the breathless silence before impact. Doctors murmured, nurses passed by with hurried steps, detectives whispered in corners. All of them waited for the same thing, for the boy to wake up and explain the unexplainable. When he finally did, his voice was thin as frost. There was a man, outside the tent. The officers leaned in. What man? Nils swallowed, and his throat clicked painfully. Black clothes. And something red. Bright. It wasn't enough. Descriptions are the lifeblood of investigations, but these were the kind that drained hope instead of fueling it. One detective sighed and rubbed his temples. Black and red. Could have been a jacket, a cap, a scarf, or a fever dream. Another countered, a fever dream doesn't tear a tent open. Still, the details were too blurry. Trauma does that. Memory, when shaken hard enough, becomes like lake water stirred by stones, cloudy, confusing, and slow to settle. Finally someone suggested hypnosis. The idea wasn't as dramatic as movies make it seem. No swinging pocket watch, no chanting, no mystical nonsense. Just a softly lit room, a trained psychiatrist, and a boy trying desperately to stitch together the fragments of a nightmare. The psychiatrist, a man in his 50s with soft eyes and a mustache too big for his face, spoke gently. Nils, we're not here to force anything. Just let your mind walk back at its own pace. Nils nodded, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Close your eyes, the psychiatrist said. Breathe. Go back to that moment, not to feel it, only to observe it. Easier said than done. Nils inhaled shakily. His eyelids fluttered. And suddenly the thin, sterile smell of the hospital dissolved into pine needles, wet earth, and iron. The tent returned. The canvas glowed faintly with the dim light from outside. The footsteps circled. His voice, half murmured, he was outside. Watching. What did he look like? The psychiatrist asked calmly. Silence. Then. Tall, maybe tall. I don't know. Shadows. But the colors. He winced as if the memory physically hurt. Black and red. Bright red. Like something painted. Or glowing. Face, the psychiatrist asked. Nils's brow furrowed. His fingers twitched. He had one, he said. But it was wrong. Like my eyes couldn't find it. Like he was turning away. Or the light was hiding him. Or I was. A long pause. Did he say anything? Nils's breath hitched. No words. Just breathing. Slow. Not rushed. Like he had all the time in the world. The psychiatrist nodded gently. Let your mind paint the image. Don't force it. What do you see now? The boy's face twisted, somewhere between concentration and terror. I see a jacket. Maybe leather. Black. A stripe of red. Or a scarf. Moving a little in the wind. And his hair. I don't. He hesitated. No. Not long. I don't think so. Maybe dark. Maybe short. A contradiction. A direct clash with the birdwatcher's account. The officers in the room exchanged glances, the kind that said we're getting nowhere. But the psychiatrist held up a hand, asking for patience. Do you see his eyes? He asked. Nils stiffened. His voice dropped to a whisper. I don't think he wanted me to. The psychiatrist nodded slowly and signaled to end the session. The boy opened his eyes, disoriented and trembling, sweat forming at his hairline. One detective muttered under his breath, so our suspect is, what? Tall, maybe not tall, with long hair or short hair, with a jacket or a scarf. Excellent. Another replied, at least we know he breathes. That's a start. Black humor, the last tool investigators have before despair. The psychiatrist defended the boy gently. Trauma distorts. It protects the mind by bending the edges of what it can't accept. His inconsistencies aren't lies, they're wounds. Wounds don't help us catch killers, the detective snapped. Sometimes, the psychiatrist said softly, wounds tell you more than facts. Later that evening, alone in his hospital room, Nils stared at the dark corner by the window. His ribs ached, but his memory ached more. He whispered to himself. I saw him. I know I did. Why can't I see his face? No answer came. Just the faint hum of the hospital lights. And the persistent echo of a breath that wasn't his. The police would release the composite sketch based on the hypnosis session. A blurred, almost abstract face. People would call it too vague. Too strange. Useless. But sketches don't fail on their own. Sometimes the truth simply refuses to be drawn. And somewhere far from the hospital, in a place where the pines grew tall and secrets stayed buried, a man no one could clearly remember continued walking, unnoticed, unbothered, unidentifiable. A shadow with a splash of red. A ghost with no face. The echo of a night that refused to end. Chapter 7, The Men in the Funeral Photograph. Funerals have a way of pulling the world into slow motion. Every sound becomes too loud, every whisper too sharp, every breath too heavy. The air thickens with quiet grief, and with the unspoken knowledge that nothing will ever make sense again. The funerals of the Bodom Lake victims were held under a gray sky that looked as if it wanted to apologize but didn't know how. Families clung to each other, neighbors stood stiffly with hats in hand, and police officers lingered at the edges like shadows trying not to intrude. Nils, still recovering, was not there. But the town was, and so were the cameras. A photographer moved quietly between the mourners, respectful, distant, capturing the fragile stillness of the moment. He didn't know he was about to freeze a ghost into film. Weeks later, when investigators reviewed the photographs, they weren't looking for clues. Not really. They were just doing what investigators do when they're stuck, staring at the details, hoping one of them stares back. But in one photograph, it did. At first, no one noticed. The image was simple, a cluster of mourners standing near a grave, faces downcast, flowers drooping. But then someone pointed, hesitated, leaned closer. "Who's that man?" a detective asked. And just like that, the photograph became a riddle. The man stood slightly apart from the others, as if unsure whether he belonged. He wore a dark coat that seemed too heavy for summer, buttoned up to the collar. His posture was stiff, formal, almost military. His face was half turned away from the camera, caught in a frustrating angle where identity slips out of reach. But what truly unsettled the room was this. The faint splash of color near his chest. A stripe. Dark, but unmistakably tinged with something bright. Something red. Or orange. Or something the mind wasn't prepared to identify. A detective exhaled slowly. "Tell me I'm not imagining that." No one told him. The police combed through the lists: family, friends, neighbors, anyone with a connection to the victims. No one recognized the man. He wasn't from the school. He wasn't from the nearby towns. He wasn't part of the investigation. He wasn't clergy. He wasn't supposed to be there at all. Someone murmured, "People wander into funerals sometimes. It happens." But the room didn't buy it. Not with the intensity of that half-hidden face. Not with that streak of color. The photograph was shown to Nils weeks later, after he was awake enough to handle it. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Do you know him?" the officer asked. Nils's fingers tightened around the frame. He leaned closer. His breathing slowed. Finally, he whispered, I don't know. Maybe. He looks like." He stopped. Shook his head. "No. I can't be sure." The officer pressed. "Does he look like the men from that night?" Nils's jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. "He looks like someone who doesn't want to be noticed," he said softly. "That's all I know." It wasn't an answer. It wasn't proof. But it was enough to make the room feel colder. And the strangest detail. In every other funeral photograph, the mysterious man stood at a slightly different angle, always just far enough to keep his face in shadow. As if he understood exactly how to escape the camera's eye. A detective joked darkly, "Maybe he reads detective novels. That's something I'd do if I were guilty." Another shot back, You can't even hide your lunch from the interns." Laughter. Forced. Uneasy. Because jokes are easier than accepting the truth that a possible witness, or worse, a possible suspect, had walked straight into the center of the grieving families and stood among them, silent and unnoticed. Some people later claimed the man resembled someone they'd heard rumors about, a strange figure from Helsinki, often mentioned in hushed tones. A man whose name would weave itself into the case like an unwanted thread. But that part of the story comes later. For now, all that remained was a photograph. A frozen moment. A stranger hiding in plain sight. A man with a shadow where his face should be, and a hint of bright color where none belonged. The lake had kept its secrets. Now the photograph kept one too. And somewhere, buried deep in Nils's fractured memory, something stirred. A recognition too slight to grasp. Too heavy to ignore. Chapter 8, The Hypnotist's Room. The room where they brought Nils looked nothing like the ones you see in movies. No swinging pocket watches. No velvet curtains. No mystical shadows dancing on the walls. Just a plain office in a plain building, the kind that smelled faintly of coffee grounds, dust, and the old radiator that never quite worked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like tired insects, casting a pale glow over the worn-out carpet. A doctor sat across from him, though calling him doctor felt generous. The man looked like someone who had been late for every appointment in his life. His tie was crooked, his collar wrinkled, and his eyes carried that particular kind of exhaustion reserved for people who spent their careers listening to things no one else wanted to hear. His name was Dr. Alto. A man whose voice sounded like he hadn't slept in several decades. "Relax," he said softly, adjusting his glasses in a way that did not inspire confidence. "We're not here to force anything. Just to see what your mind might be willing to offer. Nils shifted uncomfortably. His hands trembled. Not from fear of hypnosis, but from fear of remembering. There are memories that hide for a reason, after all. Sometimes the mind is kinder than the truth. Dr. Alto dimmed the lights, leaving the room in a half-darkness that made the walls seem closer than they were. He spoke slowly, rhythmically, guiding Nils through breath after breath. Just listen to my voice, the doctor murmured. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Good. Let the night come back, but only if it chooses to. Outside, someone closed a door loudly. The sound echoed down the hallway like a misplaced gunshot. Nils flinched. Dr. Alto barely blinked. They can wait, he said. You and I are going back to the lake. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time became elastic, stretching and folding in on itself. Nils's breathing slowed. His eyelids fluttered. Sweat gathered at his temples. I see, the tent, he whispered. His voice was distant, like he was speaking through water. Good. Stay there. Do not move forward yet, Alto said, his tone steady, calm, almost too calm. What do you hear? Breathing, Nils murmured. Not mine. Alto leaned forward. How many voices? One. Close. Too close. His fingers curled into fists. The doctor noted the tension. Now, look outside the tent. What do you see? Silence. A long, stretching silence. Then. A shadow, Nils breathed. It's tall. Broad. Standing still. Colors. Alto asked gently. Black, mostly. But there's something bright. On the chest. Like a stripe. Or. He swallowed hard. I can't tell. Everything moves when I look at it. The doctor didn't break eye contact. Does the shadow have a face? Another silence. Longer this time. Thicker. Darker. No, Nils whispered at last. It's blurred. Like fog. A tremor ran through him. Like, it doesn't want me to see it. Alto's pen paused above his notebook. Describe the hair, he said. Nils drew a shaky breath. It changes. This time, the doctor's eyebrows twitched upward. Changes how? Sometimes, it's long. Light-colored. Like straw in the sun. A pause. Sometimes short. Dark. Like another person entirely. The room seemed to exhale. Alto scribbled something quickly. Do you recognize this person? Even a little. Nils hesitated, a hesitation thick enough to drown in. His lips parted. His eyes remained closed. I think, he began. I think I've seen him before. Not at the lake. Somewhere else. Somewhere far away from the water. Alto leaned in. Where, Nils? Nils's voice dropped to a fragile whisper. In town. Watching us. Days before. A cold ripple went through the room. Watching whom? Alto pressed. Us, Nils said. Me. Seppo. Taliki. Ermeli. His breath hitched. We laughed at him. We said he looked like a scarecrow who had lost his field. A pause. A slow, miserable realization. He heard us. The doctor set his pen down. And after that, he asked. Nils's face tightened. The muscles in his jaw quivered. I remember his eyes, he whispered. They weren't angry. A shiver ran down his spine. They were patient. Alto's expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. A tiny flicker of concern. Or fear. He spoke more gently now. Do you think this man followed you to the lake? No. Nils paused. Not think. He swallowed. I know. A chill spread through the room, through the doctor, through the floorboards themselves. Even the buzzing lights seemed to dim. Dr. Alto cleared his throat. Nils, can you tell me why he was there? Nils opened his eyes. Just barely. And in that fragile space between waking and remembering, he whispered. To finish what he started. Alto froze. He didn't write that down. The session ended. The lights came back on, too bright, too honest. Nils blinked as if waking from a nightmare he feared wasn't over. In the hallway, officers crowded around the doctor. Well, one asked. Did he describe the suspect? Alto hesitated, a hesitation rare for a man in his profession. He described. He chose his next words carefully. A presence. The officers exchanged frustrated looks. Alto walked away before they could question him further. He didn't want to answer what he couldn't explain. And deep down, he suspected something terrible. It wasn't just the suspect who didn't want to be seen. Some memories don't hide because the mind is weak. They hide because the truth is strong enough to break you. Chapter 9: The Blonde Ghost of Helsinki. Rumors travel faster than truth, especially in a country where the nights are long, the forests whisper, and everyone pretends not to notice the strange man staring at them from across the street. By the time summer faded into the early chill of autumn, a name had already begun to wander through the case files, through cafes, through the muttered conversations of policemen who didn't want to be quoted. A name spoken quietly. Cautiously. Like it might hear you. Hans Assmann. He arrived in the investigation like a cold draft slipping under a locked door, unexpected, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Not because he confessed. Not because anyone caught him. But because he was exactly the kind of man people pointed at when they didn't know who else to accuse. He lived in Helsinki, but rarely seemed present anywhere. Neighbors said he walked like a man, always listening for footsteps behind him. He wore long coats, even in warm weather, and gloves that looked more fashionable in spy novels than on Finnish streets. Some claimed he smelled faintly of chemicals. Others insisted he smelled like cheap cigarettes and fear. One woman swore he never blinked. Another insisted he blinked too much. Confusion surrounded him like an aura. But the most striking detail: his hair. Long. Light. The kind of pale blonde that photographs tend to exaggerate until it glows like the halo of a saint, or the warning of a ghost. And people remembered that description because the birdwatchers, those silent observers perched near Bodom Lake, had sworn they saw a man that night. A man with long, blonde hair. When rumors reached the police, they sighed. When the journalists heard the name, they sharpened their pencils. And when the townspeople heard it, they leaned in closer to each other. Because Hans Assmann was not just a man. He was a story. A whisper with legs. Some said he had ties to the KGB. Some said he traveled too often, too quietly, to places that didn't appear on tourist maps. Some said he once arrived at a hospital with dirt under his nails, blood on his clothes, and a wild story about an accident that made the nurses exchange looks they pretended not to understand. And perhaps the strangest part: he was never interviewed thoroughly about the Bodom murders. Never pressed. Never cornered. Never forced to explain where he had been on that night when the moon reflected in the lake like a silver blade. But back in the precinct, one detective, a man named Leighton, who had the patience of a chess master and the sarcasm of someone who barely tolerated his job, pinned Assmann's photograph to a corkboard. The photograph was terrible. Blurry. Grainy. Half-shadowed, like Assmann had dodged the camera in the last second. Leighton stared at it with the kind of weary suspicion usually reserved for tax auditors and ex-spouses. "So this is our phantom," he muttered. "Doesn't look like much. Could be a poet. Could be a serial killer. Hard to tell the difference these days." His partner, Mikola, a round man with a tendency to sweat under pressure, looked over his shoulder. "You think he's our guy?" Leighton shrugged. "I think he's a guy. Which is already more than we have." But late that evening, when the station emptied and the lights dimmed, Leighton stayed behind, staring at the photograph. There it was again, that same flicker he'd seen in the funeral images. The posture. The tension in the shoulders. The way the eyes avoided the camera as if familiarity with surveillance was second nature. And a strange, bright spot near the collar. A reflection. A fold in the fabric. Or something else entirely. He leaned in. Too close. The terrible photo stared back at him with blurry indifference. Leighton rubbed his eyes. He was too tired for ghosts. But when he turned to leave, he caught himself glancing back one more time. As if waiting for the men in the photograph to move. To look up. To blink. Because something about Hans Assmann felt wrong in the way that only truth can feel wrong. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just quietly, suffocatingly off. Like a puzzle piece carved precisely not to fit. And in the days to come, as more rumors surfaced, about intelligence work, about disguises, about a man who changed hair color and gait depending on who might be watching, Leighton's suspicion deepened. Not because he had proof. But because the lack of proof felt deliberate. You know what the worst part is? Leighton said to Mikola one morning, half joking but not really. What? He's the kind of man who would attend a funeral he had no business being at. He paused. And no one would notice until much later. Mikola swallowed. Like the photograph. Exactly. And somewhere far from the precinct, in a quiet apartment where curtains always seemed half-drawn, Hans Assmann trimmed his nails with methodical precision. He hummed a tune no one recognized. Smooth. Calm. Detached. A radio in the corner whispered news updates about the Bodom case. He didn't look up. Not even once. But a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. A smile too thin to be comforting. Too controlled to be casual. The kind of smile a man wears when he knows something no one else does. Or when he knows they will never prove it. Chapter 10, The Unraveling Threads. The Bodom case had, by now, grown into something larger than a crime. It was an ecosystem, a sprawling, chaotic swamp of theories, fears, testimonies, and half-truths. And like any swamp, it sucked in anyone foolish enough to walk too deep. Detective Leighton, unfortunately, was already knee-deep. His desk looked like a battlefield, coffee cups stacked like improvised fortifications, pencil stubs scattered like broken bones, and the case folder lying open like a wound that refused to heal. He stared at the list of suspects. Not a list, really, more like a graveyard of dead ends. Vagrants. Local troublemakers. Tourists who'd camped nearby. A man whose only suspicious behavior was owning a tent that vaguely resembled the one at the crime scene. Every lead faded like a footprint in the rain. Except one. Hans Assmann's name sat at the bottom of the page, written in Leighton's own hurried handwriting. Not official. Not approved. Just an instinct scrawled in ink and frustration. Mikola waddled into the room carrying 2 cups of what resembled coffee only by color. You look like someone buried you alive, he said, dropping 1 cup onto Leighton's desk. The liquid inside sloshed dangerously, as if offended by the idea of being consumed. Leighton didn't look up. Tell me something new. Anything. Mikola hesitated. Well, we got another statement from the birdwatchers. Leighton groaned. Let me guess, they saw a flamingo this time. No. A man. Again. Mikola scratched the back of his neck. Long blonde hair. Same description. Close to the lake. Closer than last time. Leighton pinched the bridge of his nose. So either our birdwatchers are hallucinating, or the man really was there. Mikola nodded. You know what I think? No. But I'm sure it will give me a headache. Mikola leaned in, lowering his voice as if the walls might be listening. I think whoever was there that night was watching them for a long time. Days, maybe. Not just wandering in. Not just passing through. Leighton didn't answer. His silence was louder than agreement. Because he had been thinking the same thing. And the idea was growing roots inside his mind. The killer didn't choose them at random. He didn't stumble onto the campsite. He followed them. Whether out of anger, obsession, or something far worse. That evening, the wind howled against the station windows with the intensity of a living thing. Papers rustled. Chairs creaked. The whole building felt restless. Leighton stayed late, again. The quiet hours were the only time the case seemed willing to speak. He reopened the funeral photographs, enlarging them under the desk lamp. The grainy figures stared back, motionless, eternal. But one remained different. The stranger with the blurred face. The heavy coat. The rigid posture. Leighton traced the figure with his fingertip, as if feeling the silhouette might reveal something the camera couldn't. There. Near the collar. That faint streak of brightness. Too small to identify. Too deliberate to ignore. Maybe a scarf. Maybe a badge. Maybe nothing. But Leighton felt an itch behind his ribs, the same one he felt right before a breakthrough or a breakdown. He reached for the other photo, the terrible one of Hans Assmann. And his heart stopped. The angle was different, the resolution was awful, and the lighting was disastrous, but the collar. The collar was the same shape. The same fold. And the bright mark, whatever it was, sat in the same place. It could be coincidence. The mind sees patterns in clouds, in stains, in shadows. But this didn't feel like clouds or shadows. This felt like a thread. A thin, fragile thread connecting two worlds. The world of the dead. And the world of a man who pretended he didn't see the news. Leighton whispered to himself, it can't be this simple. Because nothing in the Bodom case was simple. And yet. The more he stared, the more the photographs stared back. The next morning brought rain, the kind that turned streets into mirrors and people into silhouettes under umbrellas. Leighton walked into the station soaked, annoyed, and convinced he was either onto something or losing his mind. Mikola was waiting for him, pale and sweating more than usual. We have a problem, he said. We always have a problem. No, this is new. Mikola swallowed. It's Nils. Leighton's stomach tightened. What about him? He's been asking questions about Assmann. Mikola lowered his voice. Specific questions. Leighton froze. How would he know about Assmann? That's the problem. Mikola wiped sweat from his forehead. Someone told him. Leighton's pulse thudded. Who? No answer. Because the list of people who could have told Nils was small. Too small. And none of them had a reason to. Unless someone wanted Nils to remember more. Push his fragile mind further. Break it open like a locked door. Leighton grabbed his coat. We're going to see him. Mikola blinked. Now. Now. Leighton's voice was sharp. Urgent. Because bodies were easy to bury. But truth, the real truth, had a habit of clawing its way back to the surface. And if Nils was remembering things that someone wanted forgotten, he might be in more danger now than on the night at Bodom Lake. At the hospital, a nurse greeted them nervously. He's been agitated all morning. Keeps saying someone is watching him. Leighton exchanged a glance with Mikola. Someone was always watching Nils. Even when there was no one in the room. They walked toward his door. The hallway felt stretched, like time was delaying them on purpose. When they entered the room, Nils sat upright, eyes wide, face pale as moonlight. And the first thing he said, trembling, was, "He's back." Leighton's throat tightened. Who? Nils raised a shaking hand and pointed to the window. The man with the hair. The one from that night. He was here. Just now. Mikola rushed to the window. The courtyard below was empty, just wet pavement and the reflection of the gray sky. No one, he said. Nils shook his head violently. You don't understand. He doesn't come to be seen. He comes to make sure I don't talk. Leighton stepped closer. Nils, what did he say to you? Nils swallowed. His voice cracked. He said he didn't finish. The room went cold. Mikola's breath hitched. And Leighton, for the first time in the entire investigation, felt fear. Real fear. Not of suspects. Not of failure. Not of ghosts. But of the possibility that the killer was not done yet. And that the truth wasn't hiding. It was hunting. Chapter 11, When the Past Walks In. The hospital room felt suffocating after Nils's words, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Even the air smelled different now, sharper, colder, carrying the metallic sting of fear. Leighton forced himself to stay calm. Or at least to look calm. "Nils," he said gently, "when did you see him?" The boy's eyes flicked toward the window again, pupils wide and glassy. "5 minutes ago," he whispered. "Maybe less." He was standing outside. Just standing. Like he was waiting to see if I'd say anything. Mikola muttered a curse under his breath. Lehtinen couldn't blame him. He walked to the window and leaned out, letting the rain hit his face. The courtyard was still empty, just puddles reflecting the gray sky and the skeletal branches of the birch trees. Yet something bothered him. A cigarette butt lay near a bench. Fresh. Still faintly smoking. Lehtinen's jaw tightened. He turned back to the room. "Nils, tell me exactly what he looked like." Nils pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. Sweat beaded along his hairline. I don't know. The same. Different. His hair looked light. He shuddered. Too light. Too light. Mikola echoed. Like it didn't belong on a real person, Nils murmured. Like a wig. Lehtinen and Mikola exchanged a look. A wig. A disguise. A man who could change appearance like a chameleon adjusting to a new branch. Lehtinen thought of Assmann's file. Sparse. Fragmented. Full of contradictions. A man with short hair. Or long. Or no one could remember. A man who smelled like chemicals. Or like smoke. Or like nothing at all. A man who was everywhere and nowhere. And now, possibly, here. The doctor entered, Dr. Alto, carrying a clipboard and looking more exhausted than usual. He paused when he saw the detectives. "I assume this is about the visitor," he asked. Lehtinen frowned. "Visitor?" Alto nodded. "Yes. A man came earlier asking about the boy's condition. We told him privacy rules don't allow us to share anything." Lehtinen felt the floor tilt. "What did he look like?" he asked carefully. Alto thought for a moment. Tall. Pale. Hair was blonde, I think. Hard to be sure. He kept his hood up. Lehtinen inhaled slowly. Deeply. As if oxygen suddenly mattered again. "And you didn't ask his name?" he pressed. "Of course I did," Alto replied, offended. "He said his name was..." The doctor frowned. "Actually, I don't remember." "Strange. I don't usually forget things like that." Mikola muttered, "Great. Perfect. A suspect with amnesia-inducing charm." Lehtinen ignored him. He turned back to Nils. The boy was shaking. "Nils," he said softly, "did he say anything else?" Nils stared down at his blanket, knuckles white from gripping it. "Yes," he whispered. He said, "It's almost time." Lehtinen felt the world slow. The clock ticked louder. Even the rain outside seemed to pause midair. "Time for what?" the detective asked. Nils's voice cracked. "Time to finish the story." They didn't leave him alone after that. A guard was assigned to the hallway. Nurses were instructed not to allow any visitors without written approval. Mikola stayed by the door, tense as a coiled spring. But Lehtinen couldn't sit still. He paced the hallway, his mind trying to connect threads that refused to line up. A man with long hair. Or short. A man who could blend in anywhere. A man seen at the lake. A man seen at the funeral. A man who walked into the hospital and left without leaving a trace. A man who didn't want Nils to speak. And Nils, a boy burdened by a memory that shifted like sand, was starting to remember anyway. Or maybe the memories weren't returning. Maybe someone was pushing them. Shaping them. Lehtinen stopped pacing. A thought struck him so hard he almost said it aloud. What if the killer didn't just follow them that night? What if he's been watching ever since? Just then, a nurse hurried down the hallway. "Detective. You should see this." Lehtinen snapped back to the present. "What happened?" "It's easier to show you," she said, breathless. She led them outside to the side entrance of the hospital. Rain dripped from the metal awning overhead. The pavement glistened like glass. "That," she said, pointing down. Leighton crouched, heart hammering. A footprint. Clear. Deep. Fresh. The tread was unusual, not a boot, not a sneaker. Something foreign. Something precise. Perhaps a model not common in Finland. Mikola swallowed. "Please tell me that's yours." Leighton said nothing. Because the truth was obvious. Someone had been standing there. Someone who never should have been that close to Nils. Someone bold. Someone confident. Someone who walked through the rain like it was nothing. And the footprint was pointed directly toward the window of Nils's room. Not away from it. As if the men had stood there for a long, lingering moment. Watching. Waiting. And then vanished. Leighton stood slowly, the rain sliding down his face, his coat, his thoughts. This wasn't a ghost. Or a rumor. Or the hallucination of a traumatized boy. This was real. This was deliberate. This was planned. And the worst part? Whoever they were dealing with. They hadn't left the past behind. They had walked straight into the present. And Leighton had the sinking feeling that the man wasn't finished. Not with Nils. Not with the case. Not with the truth. The Bodom murders weren't a closed chapter. The chapter had just turned itself. And the story was demanding an ending. An ending someone was very determined to write in their own hand. Chapter 12, The Man Who Was Never Questioned. By the time evening draped itself over Helsinki like a heavy coat, Leighton had convinced himself of one thing. They were chasing a ghost with fingerprints. A shadow that left footprints. A rumor that smoked cigarettes and showed up at hospitals. And that was infinitely worse than chasing nothing at all. He returned to the precinct long after most officers had gone home. The corridors were dim, the lights flickering with the half-hearted enthusiasm of a public building past its prime. Somewhere a phone rang unanswered, echoing like a warning. When he opened the case room, he found Mikola asleep in a chair, arms crossed over his stomach, mouth slightly open. The sight would have been funny if the day hadn't been so deeply, painfully unfunny. Leighton shook him gently. "Wake up. We need to talk." Mikola snorted, flinched, then blinked himself awake. "Is it morning?" "No. But we don't have time for sleep." Leighton tossed a folder onto the table. "Look." Inside lay everything they had on Hans Assmann. And everything looked suspiciously like almost nothing. A few hospital records. A handful of witness statements. A police note about his presence near a bar fight. And one tiny, almost apologetic line. Subject not interviewed due to lack of evidence. Mikola squinted. That's it. That's the entire reason they never talked to him. Because they didn't have evidence. Leighton nodded grimly. And because at the time, no one wanted to accuse someone rumored to have connections. Connections, Mikola repeated. "You mean?" "Yes," Leighton said. "The kind of connections that make people lose paperwork. Forget names. And walk very carefully around certain questions." The room felt colder. Mikola rubbed his temples. "You really think he's KGB?" "I don't know what he is," Leighton said. "But I know what he isn't." He tapped the table. Normal. They needed more. Something concrete. Something that pointed toward guilt, or innocence, instead of this suffocating twilight in between. So they turned to the only place left. Old files. Dust-coated archives stored in the basement, untouched for years, smelling like damp cardboard and old secrets. A clerk with thick glasses led them into the maze of shelves, muttering something about mold and allergies. The detectives began digging. For hours they sifted through faded papers, photographs curling at the edges, interview transcripts typed on yellowing pages. They found dozens of irrelevant names. A few interesting ones. A handful of dead ends. And then, a box. Unmarked. Light, as if half empty. Placed strangely far from the others. Leighton opened it. Inside were only 3 items. A photograph. A single sheet of paper. And a sealed envelope. Mikola leaned over his shoulder. What is that? Lehtinen lifted the photograph first. It showed a hospital corridor. Bright lights. Sterile walls. And in the center, a tall man walking away from the camera. His coat long. His posture rigid. His hair light. Not blonde like sunlight. Blonde like artificial fibers. Like something purchased. Adjusted. Strapped on. Lehtinen's heart tightened. It wasn't proof. Not even close. But it was something. He picked up the sheet of paper next. It was a nurse's statement from years ago. A brief note scribbled in rushed handwriting. A man came in last night. Blood on clothes. Dirt on shoes. Behaved oddly. Gave false name. Left before morning. Possible connection. Ask Dr. M. The note ended there. No follow-up. No interview. Just silence. And finally, the envelope. Lehtinen hesitated. Mikola swallowed. Well. What are you waiting for? Open it. Lehtinen tore it open carefully. Inside was a clipping from an old newspaper, folded in half. A headline. Unidentified man seen near cemetery after Bodom funeral, police decline comment. Below it, a grainy photo. The same funeral scene. The same blurred figure in the background. But this time the camera caught just enough of the man's face to show a faint, unsettling detail. He seemed to be smiling. Not warmly. Not sadly. But knowingly. As if he were watching something unfold exactly the way he'd planned. Mikola stepped back. Tell me that's not. Yes, Lehtinen said quietly. It's him. Assmann. Or the men pretending not to be him. They stared at the photograph in silence. It felt wrong. Deeply wrong. As if the men inside it understood that one day someone would look back and finally realize what they were seeing. A ghost with a pulse. A suspect without a file. A man who walked among mourners as casually as one attends a Sunday market. Lehtinen finally exhaled. Why wasn't this followed up, he asked. Mikola shook his head. Because no one wanted to follow it. Too dangerous. Too political. Too big. Lehtinen clenched his jaw. That ends now. But the truth was heavy. And it came with a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. Because if Hans Assmann had indeed been near the funeral, if he had been near the hospital, if he had been lurking by the lake, then the Bodom murders weren't just unsolved. They had been allowed to stay unsolved. And the men behind them had walked freely through cities, streets, lives, like a shadow that everyone agreed not to see. As they packed up the box, Mikola finally spoke. Do you ever feel like, we're not supposed to solve this? Lehtinen closed the lid gently. No, he said. I feel like someone hopes we won't. He lifted the box into his arms. And that someone may still be out there. Mikola shivered. You think he's still alive? Lehtinen didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew the truth no detective wants to admit. Some men don't vanish. They wait. Silently. Patiently. Exactly long enough for the past to catch up to the present. And perhaps, for the first time, the past had started walking toward them. Chapter 13, The Night Files. The city had long surrendered to darkness when Lehtinen and Mikola returned to the station with the unmarked archive box. Helsinki at night was a different creature, quieter, colder, and far more honest. Streetlights flickered like tired sentries. A tram rattled past half-empty, the sound echoing through the sleepless avenues. Somewhere far away, waves slapped against the harbor wall with the persistence of a debt collector. Inside the precinct, everything smelled of stale coffee and worn linoleum. The building groaned as if protesting their return. Lehtinen placed the box on the table. Before we open anything else, he said, let's make one thing clear. We're following a theory, not a conclusion. Rumors, sightings, coincidences. Nothing more. Mikola nodded. He looked smaller than usual, slumped in his chair like a man who suddenly felt the weight of time. "I know," he said. "We're not here to accuse anyone who can't defend themselves. Just to understand what everyone spent decades avoiding." Leighton sighed. "Good. Because the line between truth and story is thin. And tonight, it feels especially fragile." They spread the documents across the desk like pieces of a puzzle someone had deliberately scattered. The nurse's statement. The funeral clipping. The mysterious photo of the hospital corridor. A single line about a man with dirt on his shoes. 2 unverified claims from birdwatchers. The survivor's hypnotic testimony, unreliable at best. None of it pointed directly to anyone. But all of it pointed away from the accepted version. And that made the room colder. "Let's go through this again," Mikola said. The survivor described a man in black with a touch of red. Birdwatchers saw someone blonde with long hair. And the photo shows a man who... Leighton held up a hand. Remember, the long blonde hair could have been a wig. The colors could have been distorted by memory. The sighting at the funeral could have been coincidence. We can't say otherwise. Not now, not ever. Mikola nodded reluctantly. Still, he muttered, it's strange. Why would someone show up at the funeral if they weren't connected? People show up at funerals all the time, Leighton said. For reasons that make sense only to them. He didn't add the thought forming like ice in his mind. And some show up because they want to see the ending of a story they wrote themselves. But he didn't dare voice it. Not yet. They kept digging. A detail here. A phrase there. A reference in a local paper that seemed harmless until it wasn't. Hours passed. Coffee turned cold. Mikola's sarcasm slowly downgraded into silence, which was a bad sign. The further they went, the more the facts began to twist, like tree roots fighting for space underground. Finally, Leighton said what both had been thinking for too long. Look at this mess. These reports, half of them contradict each other. Some lead nowhere. Others lead everywhere. Witnesses saw different things. Objects went missing. Files were misplaced. This isn't incompetence. Mikola looked up. You think it was intentional? I think, Leighton said carefully, that someone wanted confusion. And they got it. Decades of it. He rubbed his eyes. This isn't a crime story. It's a labyrinth. At some point, Mikola found something strange, a small folder tucked inside the bottom of the box. Not official. No markings. And inside it, old police notes. Typewritten. Incomplete. One page caught Leighton's eye immediately. A forgotten officer's remark, dated just after the murders. Several locals reported a foreign man seen near the lake days before the incident. Description inconsistent. No follow-up conducted due to lack of clarity. Foreign man. No details. Ambiguous. But it linked, however loosely, to the rumors that swirled around the mysterious figure, the one whose name appeared in whispers and speculative articles long after the fact. Not proof. Not accusation. Just another loose thread in a tangle already decades old. It's like every clue comes wrapped in a disclaimer, Mikola grumbled. Everything is uncertain, inconclusive, contradictory. Who wrote a script like this? Life, Leighton said dryly. And she's terrible at editing. By 3 in the morning, both men were exhausted. The station hummed with the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, a sound that matched the dull ache behind their eyes. Papers lay scattered everywhere, forming a white sea of almost answers. You know what this feels like? Mikola finally said. Like we're reading the world's longest punchline without ever getting the joke. Leighton snorted. Maybe the joke is that there was never a punchline. Just noise. And silence. And people trying to make sense of both. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Cases like this, they don't end. They fade. And we're left wondering whether the truth drowned in that lake or walked away from it. Mikola swallowed. You really think whoever was responsible got away? Leighton hesitated. Then, softly. I think someone slipped through the cracks. And those cracks were wide enough to walk through without ever touching the sides. Outside, the city was quiet. But the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Waiting. Listening. As if the night itself remembered a sound the world had forgotten. Just as Leighton was about to close the last folder, he noticed something. A note he hadn't seen before. Faded. Barely readable. If someone finds this, look into the men with the false name. He knows more than he says. He was seen near the shore that night. But no one wants to write it down. No signature. No conclusion. Just a warning left in the margins of time. And as Leighton read it again, something tightened in his chest, a cold realization settling in. If this note was true, then someone had tried to warn investigators. Someone wanted them to notice. And someone else wanted it buried. Mikola rubbed his face. What do we do with this? Leighton closed the box gently, almost respectfully. We keep going, he said. Because whatever happened that night at Bodom Lake, it didn't end with the murders. He exhaled slowly. It ended somewhere else. Later. Quietly. Mikola looked at him. And you think we can find it? Leighton's jaw tightened. We have to try. But deep down, he already knew. The truth wasn't going to come easily. Or gently. Or cleanly. It was going to come like the lake itself, cold, dark, and carrying the weight of everything it had swallowed. And tomorrow, the water would only get deeper. Chapter 14, The Men on the Shore. Dawn broke slowly, hesitantly, as if the sky itself regretted turning the page. A gray light crawled across the station windows, washing the walls in the tired color of unfinished business. Leighton had not slept. Mikola hadn't either. They looked like two men who had stared too long into a story that did not want to be understood. At 6 in the morning, a janitor nearly tripped over the stack of papers blocking the hallway. He muttered something about detectives and their midnight dramas, but neither Leighton nor Mikola heard him. They were already moving again. A lead, thin as fishing wire, had surfaced. From the forgotten note. From the nurse's statement. From the photograph. From the sightings near the lake. All of them pointed to one place. The eastern shore of Bodom. Not the campsite. Not the area cordoned off decades ago. A different spot, rarely mentioned. A place witnesses had referred to once or twice. And then never again. They drove in silence. The highway was empty, the trees flashing past like dark brushstrokes on a gray canvas. Finland's forests always felt ancient, as though they remembered stories humans had tried to forget. Mikola tapped the steering wheel. You ever think we're doing all this for nothing, he asked. That we're chasing a ghost someone invented to fill the gaps. Leighton watched the scenery blur outside the window. Maybe, he said. Or maybe the ghost was real. Maybe he just learned to live like a rumor. That's comforting, Mikola muttered. Next you'll tell me he's waiting for us with coffee. Leighton smirked. If he is, I hope he brought sugar. When they arrived at Bodom Lake, the wind carried a distinct bite. Waves lapped against the rocks with a slow, steady rhythm, the same indifferent heartbeat they'd had the morning the bodies were found. Birds circled overhead. Tall reeds whispered in the breeze. The world looked unchanged. But trauma lingers in landscapes. Some places never forget. The detectives walked the narrow path along the eastern bank. Moss-covered stones shifted under their feet. The smell of wet earth rose with each step, metallic, like old secrets fermenting underground. This is where they said the men was seen, Mikola said. Leighton nodded. The men with long blonde hair. The men in black with something bright red. The men with dirt on his shoes. The men who gave a false name. The men who attended a funeral he didn't belong at. A single figure splitting into a dozen versions, each as unreliable as memory itself. They found the spot described in the old note, a small clearing near the water, partly hidden by trees. The earth here felt different. Compressed. Quiet. As if too many footsteps had once passed through. Leighton crouched. Boot impressions, old, distorted, but visible. Someone had been here recently. Maybe a hiker. Maybe a fisherman. Maybe no one connected to the past. Or maybe someone who still walked the perimeter of his own ghost story. Mikola scanned the shoreline. You know, the strangest part of this case isn't the murderer. Or the survivor. Or the witnesses. What then? The silence, Mikola said. The way every thread phrased just before it leads somewhere. Like someone kept cutting the line. Leighton didn't respond immediately. Because he felt it too. The invisible hand that had hovered over the case for decades. Not solving. Not sabotaging. Just preventing clarity. Like fog that lifts only to reveal more fog. They followed the shore further, until Leighton stopped abruptly. Something lay half-buried near a cluster of roots. Fabric. He brushed away the dirt. It was a piece of clothing, dark, weathered by time, eaten by soil. The remains of a jacket. A sleeve. Hard to tell. Mikola knelt beside him. Is that? No idea, Leighton said quickly. Could be from last year. Could be from a decade ago. But it was hidden. Yes. They both stared at the fragment of cloth. Black. Very black. Even through the decay. Mikola looked at him. You think this is connected? I think, Leighton said, that the lake likes to return things only when it wants to. And it usually wants something in return. Mikola shivered. You're starting to sound like the old locals. Maybe they're right. He dropped the cloth into an evidence bag. As they continued, the forest grew thicker. Shadows deepened under the branches. The wind died. Even the birds quieted. It felt like they had stepped somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Mikola exhaled sharply. I hate this place. Leighton didn't disagree. But there was something else. A presence. A feeling that someone had stood exactly where they were years ago. Watching. Listening. Waiting. Not running. Not panicked. Calm. The way a hunter is calm. Leighton touched a tree trunk. The bark was gouged, not by animals, but by something sharp. Metal. Knife. He couldn't tell. He stepped back. Mikola raised an eyebrow. See something? No, Leighton lied. There's nothing here. But the truth pressed against his ribs like frozen fingers. Someone had lingered on this shore. Someone patient. Someone confident. Someone who didn't mind the dark. Someone who might have returned. Or never left. By the time they reached the car, Mikola was pale. You think we're being absurd, right? He asked. Chasing impressions in the dirt. Imagining the murderer strolling around decades later. Leighton closed the car door with a soft thud. No. I think the absurd part is pretending this case ever played by normal rules. A beat of silence. Then he added. And I think someone knew exactly how to vanish. Not by hiding, but by standing where no one bothers to look. Mikola swallowed. You mean the shore? No, Leighton said quietly. I mean the space between stories. The place where people stop asking questions. He glanced at the lake one last time. Where the truth goes when it no longer wants to be found. As they drove away, the wind picked up again, sweeping across the water. The reeds rustled. The waves slapped. And in the shifting reflection of the lake's surface, for a brief moment, there seemed to be a silhouette standing among the trees. Watching the shoreline fade. And the detectives with it. Whether it was real, or just the tricks of early light. The lake did not say. And the water swallowed the shape before the world could register its existence. Chapter 15, Where the Silence Leads. The sky dimmed again by the time Leighton and Mikola returned to Helsinki. Evening traffic pooled like sluggish veins across the streets, headlights cutting pale lines through the growing dark. The drive back had been quiet. Not the comfortable kind. The heavy, thinking kind, where every thought is a stone dropped into deep water, and you wait for an echo that never comes. Mikola parked behind the station, turned off the engine, and leaned back with a long exhale. So, he said, we found a patch of dirt. A scrap of fabric. Some old scratches on a tree. And a bad feeling. Leighton smirked. Don't forget the bad coffee. Oh, right. The most damning evidence of all. They both chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was the only response that kept the weight from cracking them in half. But the laughter lasted only a moment. Reality pressed in again, thick and cold. Seriously, Nicola said. Where does this even leave us? Nothing we found proves anything. Leighton didn't answer. Because the truth was, it didn't have to. Not anymore. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed in greeting, or warning. The building felt emptier than usual, as if avoiding the case as much as everyone else had for decades. Leighton dropped the evidence bag on the desk. We write it up, he said. All of it. Even the things we can't prove. Nicola stared at him. You know what's going to happen if we do, right? They'll bury it. Again. Leighton shrugged. Maybe. But at least it'll be buried in daylight. Nicola rubbed the back of his neck. You ever think, maybe some stories were never meant to be solved? Leighton looked at him. No. I think some stories were meant to be solved, but someone decided convenience was more important than truth. And now? And now we're the idiots trying to finish a puzzle with half the pieces missing. A pause. Idiots, Nicola said slowly, are still better than cowards. For a moment, that felt like enough. Hours passed as they compiled everything. Notes. Photos. Statements. Clippings. Theories. Contradictions. Every thread they had uncovered. It became a report unlike anything the precinct had seen, sprawling, incomplete, filled with ellipses instead of periods. A story made of shadows. When they finally stopped, their hands were shaking from exhaustion. This is it, Nicola said. This is everything. Leighton nodded. But something bothered him. Something he couldn't shake. He stared at the last page, the page where they attempted to summarize the impossible. This feels wrong, he murmured. Because it's unfinished? No. Because it's honest. Nicola blinked. That's a problem now. Leighton sighed. In this case. It always has been. Then came the knock. Soft. Nearly polite. Both detectives turned toward the door. A man stood there. Tall. Gray-haired. Dressed in a civilian coat too formal for the hour. His face held the kind of expression seen on people who knew things they'd never admit. He smiled. Detectives, he said. Working late, I see. Neither Leighton nor Nicola answered immediately. The men stepped inside without being invited. I hear you've taken an interest in the Bodom case, he said. It wasn't a question. More like a diagnosis. Leighton's muscles tensed. Who are you? An old civil servant, the men said. One who's watched this story circle the drain for a very long time. His eyes moved over the scattered papers. The photos. The notes. The evidence bag. Then he looked up. You should stop. Not threatening. Not dramatic. Just factual. A suggestion, delivered like a dentist reminding someone to floss. Nicola stepped forward. Excuse me. The man continued calmly. Some stories do more good unresolved. People sleep easier when the past is unclear. And institutions. His smile deepened, almost kindly. They prefer it that way. Silence stretched thin. Leighton felt something cold crawl across his spine. You're saying the truth doesn't matter, he asked. The men considered this. It matters, he said. But only to the people who never get to hear it. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. One last thing, detectives, he said without looking back. If you keep digging, you may find answers. But you won't find peace. And he walked away. No name. No badge. No explanation. Just another silhouette slipping into the machinery of the city. Long after he was gone, neither man moved. Finally, Nicola whispered. What the hell was that? Leighton didn't know. Didn't want to guess. But one thing was painfully clear. Someone still cared about the case. Not in the way they did. Not in the pursuit of truth. But in the preservation of silence. They stepped outside to breathe fresh air, the sky now dark, the wind sharp enough to sting. The lake was far away, but the memory of it lingered. Calm. Deep. Indifferent. Mikola shoved his hands into his pockets. We're going to finish the report, right? Lehtinen nodded. Yes. And then what? Lehtinen looked at the horizon, a thin, cold line separating night from night. Then we hand it in, he said. And accept that some stories don't end. Mikola swallowed. And the men on the shore? Lehtinen breathed out slowly. Maybe he died long ago, he said. Maybe he walked away. Maybe he became someone else. Or maybe he's just a ghost the lake created to fill the silence. He paused. But the truth? He looked at Mikola. The truth disappeared the same night he did. They stood together, staring into the dark, the city humming softly behind them. And in that moment, brief, fragile, inevitable, they understood the final price of the story they had chased. Not answers. Not justice. Not clarity. Just the knowledge that some mysteries survive because too many people benefit from the darkness. And Bodom Lake would keep its secrets. As all deep waters do. Because sometimes the truth disappears along with those who once knew it.